Since many of you already know Amanda, I'm going to say just a very few words about Amanda. As a writer and a scholar, she's displayed uncommon imagination and breadth. As you heard from the title, her first book, which she did graduate work here at UNC to write, was a history of post-emancipation cultural production, cultural representations in the United States and post-emancipation representations in Russia. So to do that, she had to master histories of 19th century Russia and histories of 19th century United States, as well as to gain mastery of Russian. This is a very steep task, a very steep charge for a graduate student. It was a remarkable accomplishment. Since then, she's now expanded into exploring, no pun intended, exploring the history of American explorers across both the 18th into the late 20th century, or actually up to the present day. So it's a very different history she's working in here. So it really is a remarkable accomplishment, and I salute her for that. I've decided to ask you questions that are really about the writing of your book as opposed to the content. The content I think will come out, but this is not an obvious book to write. It's not the history of Appomattox or the history of World War I or whatever it might be. So there's a kind of conceptualization engaged in that I think is interesting for us to think about. And it's also a very elegantly written book for those of you who haven't read it yet. So there's a lot of craft in it that I'd like us to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about. So with that out of the way, my first question is, when you were researching this book, was there one anecdote, one vignette, one event in one of these explorers' lives where you said, that is what this book is all about? That's just the crystallization of what I'm trying to do here. And if so, what was it, or is it?
It's a great question. I don't know if there's one vignette that stands out, but there's one chapter that stands out in terms of the story being so remarkable. And that's chapter 8, and it's the story of Matthew Henson. You can see him on the bottom over there with a furry hood, but he was born in Maryland, the son of sharecroppers, born during the Jim Crow era, and he found his way to the North Pole. He was most likely the first person to reach the North Pole, even ahead of Robert Peary, the man who was leading the expedition. But he just endured so many struggles. You know, he taught himself the Inuit language. He learned how to build dog sleds. He learned how to dress and to survive in the Arctic on multiple expeditions. And I think that many people don't know who he is. And I think he's such an important historical figure. And so people like him are the reason that I wanted to write this book, so that these inspiring stories of people that deserve to be remembered can be remembered by more people.
So for many of us, the archetype of an explorer is, for example, someone you select at the very beginning of the book. You mentioned Daniel Boone, how he loomed so large in the American imagination. Others that we encounter in our earliest exposure to history are people like Lewis and Clark, who also figure in your book, or DeSoto. So when you decided you were going to write this project, you came up with a different definition of what an explorer is. And so how did you work out that definition?
That was definitely fun to play around with, right? Do we mean just discovering, you know, how do we define discover? How do we define exploration? You know, is exploration just about reaching new physical places, being the first one there, or being someone who's learning something that's sort of new to science, you know, even if other people have been there before you? So I wanted to define exploration expansively in the book. And I think you'll see some unfamiliar names and some familiar faces too. And maybe you wouldn't have thought of someone like Laura Ingalls Wilder as an explorer, or Amelia Earhart or Sally Ride as an explorer. But I think moving beyond land as a realm of exploration, moving into the air, moving into space, and then in the epilogue, we talk about the future of exploration, and I think you could define exploration even more expansively today when you're thinking about new frontiers.
So when I was reading your book, I was thinking about how, if just for the purpose of the conversation, if we expanded this beyond the United States, someone like Jacques Cousteau might be an explorer, even though in a way he invented some technical innovations for underwater exploration, but mainly he just went places that most of us can't go. Is there anyone that you wanted to include, but for whatever reasons couldn't include, who you think is an example of an explorer you really would like to have up there?
Yes, there were a couple people that did not make the cut that we considered, and those individuals were Neil Armstrong. I think the story of the moon race and the moon landing is so exciting. I mean, I'm just so inspired by it. And it figures in the book a little bit, but everyone knows who Neil Armstrong is, and so we decided to go with someone lesser known to represent the space race era, which was Sally Ride. And we also cut Nellie Bly. I had written part of her chapter. So Elizabeth Cochran, she was a progressive era journalist. She was part of this race to go around the world. I think it was 72 days or something around there, 80 days, 72 days, anyway, inspired by the Jules Verne book. And she succeeded in doing that. But, again, her story was a little more well-known, and we replaced her chapter with William Shepard. So he's this gentleman here, who has, I think, one of the most compelling stories in the book. He was the first African-American missionary to go to what was then the Belgian Congo. Born in Virginia, a state where slavery had been present recently before his birth. But he went with a white missionary who was the son of slaveholders, and they became very close. They made it to the Congo. They were working for the Presbyterian Missionary Association, and the white missionary died, and then Shepard was left all alone to survive on his own and build the mission. And the reason this story is so compelling is because he ends up uncovering King Leopold II's genocide against the Congolese people, and so does some really brave and courageous things to speak out about that during that period.
So let me ask you to just linger on him a little longer and explain your expansive definition as an explorer. And I'm not trying to question that definition, I'm just saying how he fits within the universe of explorers.
Sure. Well, he travels all through the Congo to places where there are people living already, the Congolese people living in different parts of the Congo, and to places where there aren't people, and they're just, wild animals and jungle and lots of scary things. But the reason why he was considered an explorer in his day was because he found some geographic features that were, new to science, as in people in the West didn't know that they existed. So I think there was a lake that he discovered, and then that helped him become one of the first Black members of the Royal Geographic Society in London. And then I think he becomes kind of an explorer and an activist at the same time in the service of, again, kind of exposing that genocide. So he goes off on a mission, on an exploratory mission to find where these atrocities are taking place, and then he documents that information, shares it with journalists. It makes newspapers all over the world, and really helps build that international outrage against King Leopold. So those are some examples of objectives that may be different from Daniel Boone, for instance, 100 years earlier.
But he would have, some of his contemporaries thought of him as an explorer.
Yes.
So it's not just as though you come up with the definition and imposed it upon him. It was, as you said, he was a member of probably the preeminent imperial geographical society in the country, in the world.
Yeah. But I think I don't think people would categorize Amelia Earhart necessarily as an explorer, right? We think of her more as a pilot and as an aviator, but I think you could argue that she's pushing new frontiers of flight, you know, reaching new heights, using new technologies being an interesting theme of the book too. So putting her in that category, I think, is a newer thing to do as well.
As we typically think of explorers as being facing nature by themselves, and don't think about the technology that's involved in climbing Everest for the first time,
Right.
or the Arctic and Antarctic expeditions, and certainly going to the moon. It's all about technology. It's not going to happen any other way.
Absolutely, and technology drives I would say, is present in every new advance that's made. And one, I think, chapter where that stands out is with the race to the Arctic. So it takes Peary and Henson, you know, almost 2 decades, multiple expeditions to finally get their dogs, you know, far north enough that they're as close to the North Pole as you could get using the measurements of the day. But because of advances in aviation, you've got people taking airplanes and flying, you know, airships to the North Pole just a decade later and going much faster and with much more ease than the Arctic explorers of the previous generations, you know, that they could ever have dreamed of.
So, changing the tone of my questions here a little bit, if there was one of these figures, or perhaps a figure you didn't include but wished you could have included, is there an explorer who you would most like to sit down and have a meal with?
That's a great question. Well, on a personal level, I loved reading about Laura Ingalls Wilder growing up. Maybe many of you here did as well, and seeing some nods. So she was someone, I think, you know, when I was a child, you dress up as your literary hero. I think I went to school dressed as her. So as an adult, you know, you wonder what those conversations would have been like. Were you in the same room? I'd love to sit down with her. Yeah.
As someone who never read the books but only knew it from the TV show, I didn't have that same attraction. Could you elaborate a little bit more about what it was when you read those books that you found intriguing?
Yes, I mean, I think so. You get to see her grow up over the course of the books. So as a child, you know, you're reading at the level of the age that you are, and then as you become a teenager, you're seeing her grow up and experiencing, you know, the world through her eyes in that way. But in terms of the things she encountered, you know, she was alone with her family, let's say, in some very remote places. And, you know, there's the chapter in the book features that long winter that many of you are familiar with, where her family almost starves, you know, animal encounters, just a lot of hardship and grit. And recently her manuscript was published, which has given all of us even more insight about actually how the Little House stories really put a nice spin on what was truly, truly awful. So I think the things that she endured are inspiring to children and continue to inspire me today as an adult. So
I have one last question, and then if there's other things you want to tell us about, by all means, and then of course we have questions from the audience. But your story is a story of American explorers. And as I was reading it, I was thinking about how American historians have been chided for half a century, if not longer, for our penchant for American exceptionalism. And I'm not accusing you of that, so I just want to set this up. But nevertheless, it's a claim of the provincialism of American historians. And I was thinking about this. Well, in the history of explorers, there of course were Polynesians who went all over the Pacific, which must have been, some of those journeys must have been pretty hair-raising. Like to get to Hawaii cannot have been easy when Polynesians were doing that. There are the Vikings who are going all over the place, the known world, and then what was unknown to Europeans. And then we got the British, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Italians, in the age of exploration going all over the globe. So there are a lot of explorers. So is there an element of your story that is peculiar to American exploration, other than the period of time? I mean,
Right.
Americans weren't exploring, well, as a people with a national identity that comes late in the story, quote unquote, of exploration. But is there something American about your story, or is this a kind of universal story that because you are an American scholar, you focused on that?
Great question. I think there are two things that are unique to America that come to mind. The first, I think, is just the sheer geographic nature of expansion, and how when the book begins, you have most people who are consider themselves to be Americans living on the East Coast, and then you have a little bit of the coast is settled and is known about by other explorers, and then the western interior is the part that so few people know about. So they don't know about the plants, they don't know about the animals, they definitely don't know about the different types of indigenous peoples that are living there already. So I think there's a sense to people living in America at the turn of the 19th century that there's much to explore and discover. There are other, of course, countries in the world where not everything is known. But the second part that I think is unique to America is this kind of spirit of innovation that connects to technology. And I think there are reasons relating to the political structure and the economy that lead to the types of innovations of technology that, when paired with courageous people like Amelia Earhart or Robert Peary, Matthew Henson, that those things can propel them to reach new places. The space race, yeah.
When I was thinking about what you've written, also what you just said, I was struck how there are a few other countries in the world, nations in the world, that seem to me to have somewhat similar. The political system may be different, but a similar kind of expansive, almost continental vision. Mm-hmm. The obvious ones are Canada, Australia, Russia, and the United States. And so I think we often, you as a comparative scholar of Russia and the United States have made that connection with regards to a different topic, but that's not one that Americans typically make. But Americans often feel, I think, when Americans are in Canada and in Australia, it seems like a familiar place in certain ways. There's something, a certain resonance, and part of it, I think, is the quote-unquote frontier culture. Right. And a similar kind of, as you talk about, kind of mythology of empty space that needs to be civilized and filled by people, which I think is a similarity with my limited knowledge. Also, Russians having that kind of idea that you have to go out there and push the boundaries of Russian civilization into the hinterlands. So is there anything that we haven't touched on that you want people to know about? Something you'd like to add?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I love to have dialogue with the audience, but one question I had for you all was when you think about what the goals of exploration are or have been historically, what do you see those goals as having been or changed over time?
Yeah, I was thinking about earlier. I wonder, for me, it's a personality type.
Okay.
And maybe what drives the person is just curiosity, so it's sort of something that we see everywhere.
And I'll add to that exploration is, as I see it, I think that, I know some of your people, it's also about exploring for the self. These are people who are trying to find themselves as much as they are trying to find someplace new to conquer.
Absolutely, and that is, I think, a great topic that we haven't touched on yet, which is what are the traits that lead to someone going off and putting themselves in great danger? Do you have any, I can offer some ideas, but I wondered whether you had any ideas first about what traits you think an explorer might have.
I'll jump in there. So maybe back to the first question, also for me it's kind of the uniqueness. So they might not be the first ones there, but they have a unique perspective. maybe on it, and that's a trait, that ability or desire or need to have that unique perspective.
Yeah, it's a good. Some of the explorers, they don't just go somewhere and then leave. They stay and they gain that unique perspective. Someone like Henson, for instance, who learns the Inuit language and learns how to dress and live to survive, and then goes back. And so I think that uniqueness then helps them succeed as explorers in those regions. Other ideas about traits that you think an explorer might need to have?
Like a connection to a powerful patron like a state.
Great, yeah. Thinking about funding, right? Some of these expeditions that these explorers go on are government funded, so depending on the geopolitical goals of the United States at the time. But a lot of them are also privately funded. So the Arctic expeditions were usually, crowdsourced, or wealthy donors funded them. So that is definitely an important component of exploration. Do you think that explorers need to be independent figures, or do you think they need to work well as a team?
I'm just going to throw one in. You write about generally very attractive explorers. I mean, people who, by attractive, I don't mean physically, attractive personality,
Right.
On the whole. I just coincidentally was recently talking to a historian about Magellan's voyage. I didn't know anything about Magellan. It sounded horrific. There were multiple mutinies. Magellan was a colossal jerk, apparently. I mean, more than a jerk, probably a sociopath. And most of the sailors didn't survive because they got killed off by all sorts of things. So in the case of someone like Magellan and Cortez, what comes to my mind is arrogance / hubris times 11.
Interesting. Well, I'm not, and I wonder, I don't know if those are good traits. I would say that those are not traits that.
No, I wasn't saying those were positive.
No.
I was saying maybe characteristic of many explorers.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because I think actually most of these explorers did not possess those traits, and that might have been what made them successful. Like you see individual faces here. I think John Muir was probably one of the only ones who was really working alone, but the rest of them, and maybe Shepard, but many of them had whole teams of people that were helping with the technology. Think about something like the space race. Think about the thousands of people who were involved in making those missions possible. Someone like Earhart, right? She would have she had her navigator with her when she died. She had whole teams of mechanics. Yeah, speculate, yes. But yeah, whole teams of people. I guess there's one trait that I found, in terms of being a pattern that really surprised me doing the research for the book, and that trait was a lack of secure attachment to other people. So actually, I would say most of these explorers had really troubled childhoods. So they either, parents died young, or they had relationships with their parents where the parents didn't express love in a situation like Amelia Earhart. Some of them didn't have close marriages. I'm thinking of Earhart again. She, the night before her wedding, she said, I'd really rather not get married, if you don't mind, but anyway. Most of the women didn't have children. So it just made me think, maybe it's a little easier to go out and do really, really dangerous things if you don't feel that strong connection or guilt for leaving for someone back home. So that was one common theme.
How about a tolerance for discomfort and pain?
I think that's definitely something as well. Amelia Earhart, she would fly for days and just have a little can of tomato soup. The Arctic explorers, they could only survive on, they couldn't drink water, so they had to have tea, and then just, whatever hard stuffs they had brought with them. The jungles of the Congo were extremely uncomfortable. They had malaria. It was extremely hot. People would be starving. So again, each of these explorers, the SS Fitz says, really does have a tolerance for discomfort. That's a great point.
Would a flip side of that be indifference to the pleasures of life?
It's a good question. Let me think about that. I mean, I think where these people found pleasure was in the thrill of chasing their goals. Like Robert Peary, who went with Henson in the North Pole. I mean, both of them were just absolutely fixated on reaching that goal. They would lose their fingers and toes, and they're willing to die for it. And Amelia Earhart too, I think she was willing to just push the limits of flight so far that they knew that death was a possibility, and so that was what drove them and where they found pleasure in a way too. Are there any explorers on the list here that you have particular questions about, or I can offer info? Yeah, Louise.
Yeah, can you please integrate, and I can never pronounce her name correctly.
Yeah.
Sacagawea. What's the real pronunciation of that?
People don't. There are multiple ways of saying it depending on if you are using the Hidatsa pronunciation or the
Because I was
Shoshone.
at her memorial site and said Sacagawea and was like, no, just learn her name.
It
please.
depends where you are, because both, we don't know if that was the name given to her after she was kidnapped. She's from the Shoshone tribe.
Mm-hmm.
She was kidnapped at the age of 12 and brought from Idaho to North Dakota. So she was living in North Dakota for 4 years as the, captive wife of the Canadian trader Toussaint Charbonneau. And so we don't know if her name, or it was the Hidatsa name with that pronunciation or the Shoshone one.
Okay.
Sorry.
Whatever her name is.
Yes. I say Sacagawea.
Yes. How did you pick her? And she does seem to be a bit of an outlier. I mean, she does have children. She doesn't start as an explorer on her own.
Correct.
I would like to have her integrated a little more in the others.
Yes. Okay. So the book starts with the founding of the country in terms of when it becomes an actual nation with the Revolutionary War. And I think the core of discovery is a journey that looms large in everyone's imagination, but we really predominantly think of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. And so there's also the myth, what are the myths about Sacagawea? What does the evidence really say about what her, to what extent did she play a role in that expedition? And I think the evidence says she was very helpful as a navigator, navigating geographic landmarks. She was the person who was basically responsible for enabling them to get the horses that they needed when they ran out of river and they had to go over the mountains. So those horses really enabled them to survive, and she negotiated with her own tribe, which they ran into in the mountains to get those horses. So she was really instrumental in a bunch of ways on the journey. She was only 16. She had her newborn baby with her the whole journey. So I think she's really a remarkable and very stoic figure. Yes, sir.
So the first two, just reading the book, the first two, it's Sacagawea and Beckmore, and it's geographical. It's you're mapping, you're going across the country or finding the Beckworth Pass in California or whatever. And then I'm reading Laura Ingalls Wilder, and she doesn't. Well, she moves around some, but I come to the end and wait a minute, there's no Laura Wilder Pass or river or whatever. And then sort of the light went on, because the second step, part of the exploration is sort of living on the place, populating. And she chronicled it and all that. But it was sort of, to me, it was a redefinition, an expanded, more imaginative definition of what exploring is. I guess you were reading the Little House stories all along, so it was sort of easier for you. But how did you get to that? And I love the order of those first three, sort of it sets you up for the rest of the book.
Thank you so much. Yes, so each chapter is supposed to represent a specific period in history. So we're looking at the whole history of American development through the lens of exploration. And so when we start with chapter 1 with something like the core of discovery, there's so much that's unknown to people in the East. And as you say, right, then people, these explorers and other people in their wake, start to move westward, and some of them stay, or they're moving around and living in different places. And some people would say Laura Ingalls Wilder, she's a settler, she's a homesteader, she's not an explorer. But I do think we can define it more expansively to say, that even the people who were living in a region that had been, unpopulated at that time, And and sadly, the region that she was living in, right, the Yankton Sioux had lived there, and then due to these treaties, right, that were signed by force, they were all moved out of the Dakotas, well, into a small reservation. And so what appears to her to be this unsettled land, right, had previously been lived in. So these are all, these are the complicated dynamics, right, of discovery and displacement. I think Laura's chapter is a pivotal point in the book because you really see at the end of that chapter, like how much destruction settlers bring to people through disease and through violent displacement, through the destruction of the environment. The gold rush is, an extreme example, of course, of environmental destruction and violence against indigenous people as well. But at the end of her chapter, then you've got the birth of the conservation movement with John Muir in the next chapter, and then you've got Florence. We had talked about her, Florence Marion Bailey. She's the one on the beach there. But she was she tried to save the birds who were being slaughtered in the Gilded Age in the name of fashion. So I do think that we get to a point in history where those goals of exploration change, and you start to see a shift where people are saying, this landscape is worth preserving, the animals are worth preserving, more attention to indigenous people, and that is a shift we see through the 20th century. And she's the only explorer of all the people on the sheet here that brought a baby with her on her trip. And guess what? Her baby grew up to be an explorer himself. And her baby made friends with the man that's right below her, Jim Beckworth. They became best friends and lived together in California. True story. Any other questions? Yeah, Bill.
Amanda, can you sort of reflect on the theme of exploration and journey as a literary device? I'm thinking of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the journey on the Mississippi River, and it's a trope that comes up on the road with Kerouac, and you have this repeated device in American literature that is not unlike what these explorers are doing. I wonder if you thought about that or could reflect on it. I know you think about it.
No, I haven't thought about it as a literary theme, and I think you're absolutely right that, and perhaps that's something we could say is maybe unique to American literature in some ways. But I wrote this book during the COVID pandemic, so most archives were closed. I was able to take a trip by car in the footsteps of the Corps of Discovery across the country. But because most archives were closed, I had to rely largely on the autobiographical narratives that many of these explorers left. So I think that even they realized that their journeys lent themselves to the literary form. And so we're fortunate that they were able to write down their stories so that we could have them today. Yeah. Robin.
I'll just say too, all the Laura Ingalls Wilder's books definitely use the journey as a literary device, because at the end of each book, it's like, oh, Pa says we got to move again. And Pa was definitely the explorer. He's like, oh, let's go further. Oh, let's go. Oh, too many people here. We now have a neighbor. Let's go somewhere else. And even then, at the end of one, oh, I'm engaged and I have to move again because we're going to go somewhere else.
And for Laura, I think she's one of the prime examples too, where she completely failed. They failed as farmers. The land wasn't good. They weren't able to make a success of it. They had to leave after their 4 years of farming. But she finds success as a storyteller about exploration. That's how that chapter ends, actually. Yeah. So. Good question. Any other questions, Louise?
This is a question about Americana, and because I haven't read the book, but it seems to me that this is built around individuals, and so is this, the American individualism? Is that a thing that's holding this together?
Good question. It is. There are 10 individual stories, but there's so many interesting threads that actually connect these people over time, and that connect the people that were on the teams of people supporting. So it's almost like these generations of explorers and how their lives are connected over time. and then the broader survey of how America develops and changes over 200 years. I think all of those things are part of the story.
Matt, I had a slightly different question about the difference. You're publishing an academic book with UNC Press and then publishing a trade book. And I noticed when you talked about the book, you used the authorial we in terms of some of the decision making. So I was just sort of curious if you could share your experience working with the trade publisher. I've never worked with one. And also, who was we? Was there an agent who was helping you make some of these decisions, or what the experience was like?
Yes.
And how you settled on these 10? I mean, how much? You mentioned eliminating Neil Armstrong, but how big was the original pool of possibilities?
Great questions, all great questions. It was such a learning experience, because I think academic presses have their strengths and trade presses have different strengths, and so they're just different experiences. But I had an agent at the time when I was considering what book to write next, and I pitched this idea to him, and we thought together about how to make a story, because in academia we don't think as much about stories as we do about the primary sources and what new information we're going to be learning from the sources. So it's kind of, I of course believe very much in having the sources drive the story, but there's a narrative component that I think trade presses think a lot about. So we put together the proposal. I wrote the proposal, he approved it, and then you send it out to different publishers, and then you get your offer, and then you get 18 months to write the book, which is very short feeling compared to academic books. And so I think there was a moment too in terms of putting together the list where, I had said, Armstrong would be great, and then my editor suggested Sally Ride being a better possibility, and then there was a moment when I said, I'd rather take Nellie Bly off the list. I just learned about this amazing figure named William Shepard. So I really do see, I loved the team of people that I worked with. They all had the same vision. They all worked together to shape the book into a better book. So I had a really wonderful experience with the team. Yeah.
What's your next book going to be?
It's a great
10
question.
Russian explorers.
I mean, I really enjoy writing about exploration, and I think there are a lot of great stories to tell. I live near the Explorers Club in New York City. Many of these figures are actually members there, but having visited their archives and learned more, there are so many amazing stories out there. And so I'm thinking, maybe partly due to proximity and partly due to content, that would be another, to mine those archives for some untold stories. Go there next. Any other questions?
Well, if you do more on explorers, I would be interested to hear, not to go back about distorted, tormented, twisted people, but when I was in high school, I read this book, and I hope I'm going to say the mountain name, one of the first successful assaults, as they call it, on Annapurna in the Himalayas, which I guess was considered harder to climb than Everest. And as I was reading the book, I could not figure out why any human being would do that, just to be able to say they did it. It's remarkable, but it's a very limited list of people who are going to say, wow, that's impressive, because most of us don't know where the mountain is or why it's hard. So anyways, there's, if you do more on exploration, I'd be interested to know more about that kind of, not that you don't do it, but yet more about the kind of personality type that would be attracted to doing something that a comparatively small number, not like the North Pole or the South Pole. Most of us can understand that. But some of these forms of exploration seem like there's a very small number of people who are going to be impressed by that. Like finding a new lake in Africa is so, I have no doubt that's significant, but most of us will be like, oh, okay. So it does seem like a truly exceptional human personality type would want to do this.
Yeah, I completely agree. I can't understand it personally because I'm not I don't have that personality type, the drive to go put myself in danger, but it is very exciting to read the stories of people who do have that drive. And I think maybe the more stories you read, the more kind of patterns you can find across personality types to get a sense of how they tick. Yeah. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Fitz.
Thank you.